Hello, and welcome to the Emissaries of the Gospel podcast. My name is Jeremy Brown, and I'm your host. Please make sure that you subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and make sure you click on the bell icon to get notifications. That really serves to help our evangelistic ministry, and it also helps this channel. With that being said, I want to talk about the subject of education, Christian education in general, and the role of fathers in that, as well as the government, the church, and how that all works together. So, I wanted to start out with a passage from the New Testament. Ephesians 6:4 says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." All right, so something that you may have gathered already, or you may have known already, even, but fathers have the primary duty and responsibility for the instruction of their children, right? So the education of children, the ultimate responsibility lays on the fathers, right? And we'll get into as we go, like what role does a mother play in that, and you know, how should we look at that in regards to things like Christian public schools, right? So right now, the problem that we have is you have a great deal of public schooling, so much so that the majority of Christians, including Reformed evangelicals and so forth, the majority of people who would call themselves Bible believing Christians are sending their children to public schools, right? And there's many who will say, "Well, I can't afford private school, right? Or I can't afford to homeschool them, or I have to work, or whatever it is, right?" And it's kind of a combination between hurdles or obstacles that are legitimate. There may, in some cases, I would consider them more rare, but some cases they may be legitimate reasons as it stands right now. And then in many cases, it's just excuses, right? The excuse may have many different motivations. Some of them may potentially be things like the parents want to enjoy a certain standard of living that they might have to give up if they were to homeschool or private school their children, right? They may have to give up on luxurious vacations. They may have to give up on things like the golf league, right? It may be just something like it's frustrating for them to be patient with their children and educate them, right? They may lack the confidence to do it, thinking that, oh, somebody else, just because they have this degree, must be more appropriate or more suited or equipped for this work than I am, right? So there's all of these assumptions that go into it, and many of them are not true. And even with the ones that might be, like, hey, maybe you have to give up certain luxuries, they're definitely worth it, right? And if people don't think that they're worth it, that's very concerning, right? Because the the results of doing so are catastrophic, right? And we've seen that. If you look at since the Department of Education came into being, right, every year consistently, our our scores have gone down. We went from being basically the most educated, brightest nation in the world, or at least amongst the top three, to now, easily there's 30, 40, 50 other nations ahead of us, depending on what metric you use to judge that by, right? So we clearly have been losing a lot of ground, right? You see the huge worldview problems where it's impossible to deny that there's no such thing as neutrality. You cannot look at education, especially education of literally all things. You cannot look at education as being some kind of neutral ground, right? There is no such thing as neutrality, but especially in the area of education, you are either teaching your children and raising them up in the fear and admonition of the Lord, or you are giving them over to worldliness. As Vodi Bakum likes to say, don't send your children to Rome, right, for their education and not expect them to come back looking like Romans, right? They're going to look just like Caesar, right? Um, and so we have to remember that too, right? And so then the question becomes, what is closer to the biblical ideal? Is it homeschooling, or is it Christian private schools, right? And should those schools be run um, outside of the church, even if they're funded by the church? Should the funding all be provided for by the parents, or should they be run by the churches specifically? So we'll get into all of that. Wanted to go to another scripture real quick, and says this: "Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you." So this is Moses talking to the men of Israel, right? "That you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments which I command you all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes." All right. So, um, wanted to touch on a number of things here. I don't know how deep we're going to be able to get into this, but number one, you see the men being addressed, and it's something that's to be taught to your sons and your sons' sons. So the idea here is that it's very clear that the men bear the responsibility. The men are to be the leaders, and that's in everything. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't certain things that can be delegated in certain situations, right? But the responsibility behind it all is towards the men, and that does involve some level of involvement in that, right? So then you look at, is this a father who is kind of the principal, so to speak, of the homeschool, but he employs the mother to be the teacher of the homeschool, and he has limited involvement? Is he the primary teacher and mom is the teacher's assistant, right? Is this a case where the father is doing devotionals with the children every day and going through a catechism with them that he has either designed himself or he has reviewed and approved from another source, and then is sending his children to a Christian private school for academics, right? Um, I would say that the paradigm that we need to consider how to get back to is a paradigm that most parents are employed from their home, right? The idea is that they either do own land or are pursuing, seeking to own land, um, or in some other way they own a home and they have the ability to be productive from their home, that they have a sufficient and secure income from home, and that they are doing something that they can, in some way, shape, or form, include their children on, or train them up in. So their children will have a valuable skill and potentially even own a business before they even are ready to be, out into the world, so to speak. And so that's going to require potentially specialized skill and maybe working with or for Christian employers. It doesn't have to be Christian in some cases, but it's ideal. It should be. It could be that they own the company and they're employing others. That really is truly the ideal, is that Christians should be the ones who own the majority of the businesses in any community. And they should be training up people to perform that task with excellence, not the least of which is their own children, right? You're not doing your children any kind of service whatsoever if you teach them to do geography, which I would say is a valuable skill, right? It's a valuable education or valuable knowledge, but you're not doing them any service whatsoever if you teach them geography, but you're not teaching them a productive skill with it, and especially if you're not teaching them the Christian worldview that undergirds it, right? Everything that they see on a map when they're studying geography, right, and learning to understand geography, everything should be from a Christian worldview, with the foundation being the Lord Jesus Christ and his revelation and his word, the Bible, right? Everything without exception. If you teach your children science, it's the same thing. If you teach your children math, it's the same thing, right? And when you're teaching these things, they need to learn them in applicable ways, right? It's good to teach them just to be able to do something like multiplication, right? But ultimately, we need to show them how that will be applicable to their life, especially in some type of skill that we might be able to pass down to them or that they might have a proclivity in, right? And so the Christian education should be ultimately, ideally, at home. Now, that doesn't mean that both mom and dad can't be involved. In fact, they should be. I do think that there is some liberty for dad to decide what that is going to look like, but he is ultimately responsible and he should be involved to some degree, right? This is not cast it all on mom and then forget about it, right? Um, and you can have tutors come in. You can um, order online courses, or you can buy books by you know, different authors or whatever if you want to help your children learn about a specific subject more in depth than what you're capable of teaching them. In fact, you're probably going to be teaching them at a much greater depth than what the average public school teacher can. It's a myth that they teach them very well. I remember in the state that I'm from, which is Maine, there was one particular city. I won't name them for the sake of potential embarrassment for them, and also because it's possible that they have dramatically turned things around since then. But because this was several years ago, right? This was probably 15 or 16 years ago now. But this particular city in the state of Maine, or large town, it's one or the other. They were going to do a summer school because they had so many children who didn't meet basic mathematic standards, the expectations that it would take to pass them on and place them into a college. They didn't have functional knowledge of mathematics to be able to go out and be productive in the world, right? And at least according to the groups that test such things and their school board, right? And so it was suggested that there was this summer school program that would be done for remedial math, and that they were, obviously they were going to have to go to the school, and they would have some teachers doing that. And so um, one of the faculty asked, uh, well, how are we going to afford to pay for, and I think it was something like 16 teachers or 15 teachers or whatever, to, how are we going to pay for them to have this remedial class? And I said, well, why would we need so many teachers for that? And they said, well, it's for the teachers to go through and get remedial abilities in mathematics. So these teachers, and this was not some kind of joke. This wasn't a gross exaggeration or whatever. It was identifying the point that even though these teachers had degrees and maybe even advanced degrees, they didn't have basic mathematical skills and a mastery of them, and their application to be able to educate high school age young men and women, right? So, and you can look at that and say, well, maybe that's just that one area, but it's very clear that standards have fallen so low, and so many things have been done to mess with the basics of things like mathematics, and still uh, with pretty poor results. And this is not a hyper political thing either, because you have Republicans like George Bush who have done horribly ill-advised things in this area and don't reject the basic premise of the public school idea. The government school idea is how we should look at it, government school. Democrats, same thing. If anything, they've done infinitely worse towards education, right? Especially science, ironically, and social studies. But be that as it may. Oh, and English and English literature too. So anyhow, the idea here is that you have people that have, maybe not in all cases and in all places, but in many cases they have lacking competency. They're barely competent, right? They're not necessarily more skilled at all than the parents. They don't know the children more than the parents, and they certainly can't give them more one-on-one attention than the parents can, right? At least not in the overwhelming majority of circumstances. We're talking like 97 to 99% of the parents can have a better expertise over their child, can be more effective communicating with them, and can devote more one-on-one time with them than any of these teachers can, right? Not to mention they have a completely different foundation for education and a different agenda, right? The agenda shouldn't be, making you a good subject of Caesar, so to speak, but it should make you a good subject of the Lord, right? A good neighbor because you love the Lord your God first, the Lord Jesus Christ, and explicitly are honoring him and loving your neighbor, right? So you're not looking to be just a quiet, compliant cog in the machine that blindly follows Caesar like the Pied Piper and the children following it wherever he goes. No, you are looking to be a productive citizen in the kingdom of God in whatever city, state, or nation that God has put you, right? Um, so okay, so that's just some general parameters. And it's interesting here that some of the most important things should be the commandments of God. We should understand God's law and his ethics, right? That should be preeminent. And through those and through the knowledge of God and the logic of God, we understand things like mathematics. We understand things like reading and writing. We understand, why you have such things as grammatical structure, right? Why grammar could be important because we understand the decency and order that flows from God, and we understand the vital importance of communication, effective communication, where two people can understand one another. We understand that you have to be able to communicate and understand one another to be able to instruct and correct one another, right? These are just things that we take for granted, but more and more and more, it becomes evident that people are losing sight of that, right? We have to be able to understand writings from the past. So the writings of people prior to 1900, as an example, or especially prior to 1800, are not completely obsolete. There is much to learn about the origins of our nation and its structure and founding. There's much to be learned about God's law and the tradition of things like English common law and so forth. There's a tremendous amount of information out there that's important, and we need to be able to have our kids having the ability to read historic documents, right? We can't lose that. So as an example, learning something like cursive is valuable just for that. Learning other languages can be very important towards that end, right? Learning history, we teach history in terms of, what happened on this date in December, and children are supposed to recite the name of the event, and we call that teaching them history. And really, it's more important that they understand the actual nature of the event and what happened and why. And they have like an ethical, judicial, even eschatological, if you will, type of view of that event so they can understand the world around them. Now, this doesn't mean I think all parents have to be experts in biblical eschatology, right? But what I think is more often the case is you subtly have learned eschatology through sermons and books that you've read and so forth. And it just comes out in the words that you say, right? So that's a worldview thing that, yes, we should probably learn that. It is important for sure. And even probably one of the top, 5 to 7 or 8 doctrines that are out there, right? As far as, once you're saved, right? What are the next most important doctrines after that? And it would definitely be right up there. But what you do is you give your children a worldview about history. And why is that important? So they understand how to move forward in the future. They have certain values that develop from that. And they're able to evaluate decisions in the future much more easily from that foundation, right? So it's very important that they have a Christian foundation for everything. And again, the more intimately they receive it from home, the more that you are going to be able to impart your own values and beliefs to your children, right? This is how, by the way, this is how you're able to keep children in the faith and keep churches together and so forth, because we don't, when you're being educated, right? Here's the way we treat Christian education. We treat Christian education like a salad bar. We pick the verses and beliefs that we want. We pick the churches that we want, even the brothers and sisters in the faith that we want, and we kind of everything is to our preference. We hear from the teachers that we want, and some of that you're not going to be able to avoid. But we give like this buffet of options, right? But when it comes to education, they send their kids to government school. There's one option, right? And they learn one set of values. And if you don't think they're learning a set of values there, you are crazy or you're on drugs, right? Or you're just throwing your head into the sand and you don't want to know what's going on. None of those are good, by the way. But you send your kids to school and they collectively receive this one set of values being given to them, right? The set of values that they should be given during their education is one set of values, but it should be the values of their parents, right? Assuming that they're Christian parents, right? So wanted to keep going on this. This same commandment, by the way, is echoed in Deuteronomy 4:9. Only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, unless they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children, right? So this shows us that we have, a responsibility to our children and even our grandchildren in terms of their education. So grandparents are vitally important for children's education. And that may be helping them with homeschooling. That may be taking part in family devotions from time to time. That may be the way grandparents help to instill values when children are visiting them. That may be when they have family reunions and family gatherings and celebrate holidays at grandma and grandpa's house, and so forth, right? But these are things that are to be kept diligently. They're to be remembered. They are to be taught and known, right? Deuteronomy 11:18-20, same thing. You shall therefore lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. And you shall teach them to your children, talking of them when you're sitting in your house, when you're walking by the way, when you lie down and when you rise. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So again, this language is repeated. The idea of God's commandments, right? His word being kept on your gates, on doorposts. You're supposed to have these things be visible where you and your wife and your children can see them. And your kids may ask, well, what does that mean, Dad? Mommy, they might be even really little. What does that say? Okay, what does that mean? What does God want me to do? Does it mean God wants this, right? They may say, what if this, what if that, and what happens? You actually learn the law better yourself because you have to know it well enough to answer your kids, right? Um, so, and it's organic, right? When the question comes into your child's mind, you are learning to answer those questions, obviously to the best of your ability. But you may give them simple answers, right? Children probably only need a simple answer most of the time. Your kids are going to be inquisitive. They're going to ask all these questions. Also, when you are seeking to do things, right? Like, grandma is looking to make, homemade bread, or she's making some brownies or something like that. She has, her grandchildren there, and she tells them something about the Lord through, not only verbally saying something about it, but through the way that she um, makes this food, right? To bless her family, to love her family, right? And the children can participate in that. They learn that, and there's even a reward for it, right? The brownie batter, they might be able to, lick the spoon or the beater or the spatula or whatever. At least if you grew up in a place like where I grew up, right? Um, when dad is, he's working on the fence or the deck or something outside, or he's, caring for, the property in some way. He's fixing the door because, there's something wrong with the door casing, the door jamb, or the hinges. Maybe the locking mechanism is wrong. And so he's fixing that, and he's teaching the children something as he's doing that about, the way God has ordered things and what God has commanded, right? When you raise animals, right? The same thing, just an example, a righteous man knows the condition of his flocks, right? And so not only are they seeing that by example, by the patterns that you keep and the things that you do and what you're telling them, and you're explaining what you're doing and why you're doing it with the children. And so that naturally flows in, and they understand something about the world from that, right? So let's talk about private Christian education, right? And so there's two ways that this can happen. One is it can happen where you have a school formed or founded privately that holds to Christian precepts. It has some kind of charter to that end, and parents can pay to send their children there. I think this is perfectly acceptable. I don't think it's the ideal, at least not in all circumstances, but it's perfectly acceptable. And in some cases, it may be really necessary. And the best setups that I've seen for these schools so far take into account, parents' income, or they may have like some kind of scholarship program or something, or the churches of those parents participate. Either they automatically send a certain amount per student for any child of a family that's in their church, or they come in for those who need help, and they meet whatever difference that the parents can't make. Or there's even instances where they may choose to kind of like sponsor another kid from their community, right? And say, yeah, we're going to pay for that child to have a Christian education, right? What are some of the benefits of this, right? Well, if for some reason you're in a particular situation where maybe both mom and dad legitimately have to work, and they're still doing family devotions. They're not skimping out on that. They're faithfully attending church. Hopefully, whenever there's a service, if possible, right? Um, but it may just be something where they're not able to time wise um, give the type of time and attention to each of their children that they need to effectively give them an education. So it's easier for them to catch up with the children during the day and try to keep track with the teachers and understand. I do think they have to do their due diligence and really know what that school is teaching, especially if it's a school not attached to their church, because usually you find out more the closer it is to your family and your church, right? Whereas the more removed it is, the less that you tend to know about what's going on or who is involved or anything like that. And those are critical issues, right? So then you have what I would consider the next closest thing to ideal, which is where the church um, has the school. Now, some people would think you should still pay for that, and I am I'm sympathetic towards that, but I actually think that the churches should provide that out of what they have for tithes for at the very least from members of their church, or like a denomination for people who have children that are their parents are members of churches in that denomination, right? And maybe even make exceptions, like if the grandparents, they're going to drive their children from maybe a couple towns over to come to that school because they know what they're going to get there, right? They could do that, but then maybe they charge a nominal fee for parents who aren't part of their church but still want to send their kids there. Um, the biggest thing here is it should not be prohibitively expensive, even for a lower income family. That when it's done by the church, especially, it should be something where, yeah, obviously through offerings and tithes and so forth and different things, that it would be sustainable, right? But it definitely shouldn't be something where um, they're not enabling children to have an education. However, that being said, I would deny the idea that every single one of those children has an inalienable right to be educated there. Meaning, and I would say that for a government school as well, even though I don't believe government schools should be a thing, at least not the way we know them now. And here's why: because you can have a child that is dangerous, that is dangerous to the other children, and they continually are able to uh, go back to that school or even re-enroll in it, um, without necessarily having any repentance or correction that's demonstrable. Um, these kids can corrupt the children there in horrible ways, and obviously the public school is a prime example of that. When kids go to a government school, they are corrupted in almost every way, especially sexually and religiously, right? Their corruption is virtually complete by the time they leave high school, if not by the time they leave grammar school, right? Um, you have safety issues. You have the interruption of education when children have um, severe um, behavioral issues, you know, and some of that can be a spiritual thing, right? In fact, there's always an element of it being a spiritual thing. Um, if they're able to disrupt every other kid there, then ultimately the whole community suffers or even fails for the sake of the one. Now, do we want good things for that one child? Obviously, right? But we can't be wrong-minded about it, where we say, okay, well, no matter what, you have to have this kid here. See, this is kind of like, the more liberal mindset. This is also why, by the way, I don't think that uh, when it comes to the decision-making levels of education, especially outside of the home, outside of the individual family, I don't think that women should be involved in that, because you have to have a more principled look at it. You have to have people that are looking at it strictly from ethics and precepts, and are not looking at it in terms of inclusion and feelings and that kind of thing. Yes, we're sympathetic people, but our sympathy does not dominate everything else, right? And sympathy and that kind of inclusion and those types of things is a beautiful thing with a mother who is, nurturing her children and caring for them and tending to their very specific needs that she has learned over time, right? Um, but it's not a good thing when it's just broadly extended out there in what essentially amounts to an unprincipled manner, so that you basically, um, almost kind of out of pity's sake, uh, keep keep a disruption or a danger or a corrupting influence around the children simply because you don't want to do something that could be seemed as, mean or insensitive. Um, could there be other things for that child to help them, get back to a point where they could be reintroduced? Sure, but ultimately, I think that's why you have men there, because they're also not going to use intuition to determine how they make decisions there, but it's going to be based off from ethics, right? And ethics are critical for everything. Um, so again, after being educated in your home, the next best place for them would be to be in your church's school or your denomination's school, right? There should be at least, even a loosely affiliated group of area Christians where even if they don't agree on all the specifics of, denominational distinctives, they're all Protestant Christian. Yes, being Protestant matters. There are essentials of the faith that are caught up in that. So that's one that you can't ever give up on. You could have a child from a Catholic family in your school, but there would be some strict requirements around that, and the school would have to be very thoughtful in how they did that. And basically, it would be an element of, you're not here to bring your Catholicism into here, but we are here, and we're going to put our Protestantism into you, right? And that's not hypocritical, because when you're trying to do what's righteous and good, again, there's no such thing as neutrality, right? It's not always, well, if you can do this, I can. When it comes to things like that, there's one way, and that's it, right? When it comes to education and ethics and theology and whatnot, um, you can't um, you can't have somebody from a completely different faith that has a different gospel um, be the ones influencing your kids, right? You have to be influencing them. Um, all right. So, can some of the teachers in these schools be female? Well, um, ideally, you would have predominantly male teachers, if not exclusively, because children should learn that those that they seek, especially when you're teaching theology, right? Yes, particularly in homeschooling environments, mothers are not only allowed and encouraged to be involved, but they're actually commanded to be there, to be a helper in the education of their children, at least in the idea of uh, discipling their children, and particularly evangelizing them. I would say that the dad is, so long as he is within the bounds of orthodoxy, the dad is the one who decides ultimately what they will learn doctrinally. So if mom and dad have a disagreement on something, mom submits to and defers to dad and doesn't try to teach the kids something contrary. And outside of the parameters that dad sets, she doesn't even say, well, I want the kids to be exposed to both. No, like if dad says, I want to teach the kids the differences, and you do it the way dad says, right? Like, so it's not, oh, dad said you get to be exposed to both. I'm going to create a straw man of dad's position and tear it down and tell you why I think mom is right, right? You don't get to do that. It very much so. You have to honor, if you're a mother, you have to honor the theology of the father in as much as you can, and discuss things privately. If you have disagreements, but ultimately you must submit to him and his decision and how to raise those children, and be united in raising those children in every way that you can be, and not opposing him, right? In the same way, you're going to give up a little bit of that when that goes out to the church or the denomination or the whatever the local unaffiliated, Christian private school, right? Um, if that's the case, you definitely can have women teaching there. It should be younger ages, right? By the time a child reaches about the age of 12 or 13, particularly if they're male, right? They should only have men teaching them, right? They should understand that as adults, right, women do not get to have authority over adult men or men who are in even their early adulthood. So, example, men that are between 13 and 18. Uh, there is a tension there in terms of what goes on in their house and how that works and how you look at them in terms of whether or not they're an adult yet. But certainly, the school or even the church, they don't get to make that decision, right? And furthermore, because that's under the sovereign sphere of authority of the family, right, which falls under the dad. But not only that, um, you want to set the general principle for everyone in your community, especially in your church community, your communities of faith, right? That the people who are to hold positions of authority and the people who are ultimately to be looked up to for doctrine, to teach them like systematic theology and biblical theology and whatnot, that's going to be specific men, right? Like their father, husband for a young woman, right? That the people who are recognized as the elders of the church who have been appointed as elders, those who are recognized teachers, under the authority of those elders, those are the men that you go to for those kind of things. And it's not that other people can't have a discussion about things. People sit down in their living room, husband and wife, and they have 2 or 3 couples with them, and their kids are there. Maybe some of them are even sitting around with them, being a part of it. And that's perfectly fine, right? But when you have like an actual didactic teaching that's happening, when you have like a Bible study, when you have a seminar or a conference, when you have Sunday school in church, when you're being given a sermon, any of that stuff, right? When you have young adults being taught like lectures and stuff from a schoolroom type setting or in some kind of video like that or whatnot, video lecture or something, it should be a male giving that. It should not be a female, right? And that's based on our created natures and the commandments that the Lord has given, such as in 1 Timothy 2:12, right? Titus 2 tells us what older women are to be training younger women in, which is in things like purity, loving their husbands and children and being submissive to their husband, that there'd be a worker in their own home, right? All right, so let's go to a couple other passages here. Proverbs 15:5, a fool despises his father's instruction, but whoever heeds reproof is prudent. So this is both education and discipline here, but I wanted to use that to just kind of double down on the idea that, while father and mother are both commanded to train up their child, ultimately it is the father and his instruction for his family, like his vision for his family, that is, he's the ultimate sense of authority in the household, and above him is God, right? And there's nobody in between, and there's nobody on the same level as dad. And then furthermore, what they are rejecting, if they reject that, is their father's instruction, right? So even the mother is to be consistent with the father's instruction. Proverbs 1:8 and 9, hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching. So here we see father and mother are both involved, for they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck. So the teaching that comes from your parents is a faithful garland, rather. This is like a pendant, right? This adorns you. And then just a little bit more on that. I mean, because I fear, and when I say this, I'm not really like afraid, but I want to make sure from my end that even though I think people definitely need to hear God's created order and the commandments He's established regarding gender and how that works out. I think sometimes when people hear that, they may, um, um, because I make such an effort to talk about the hierarchy and how that works out, I think sometimes they would be tempted to say, okay, well, women have kind of like this minimal role, and there's nothing further from the truth. They have a very vital and active role, right? And it's especially in homeschooling, which I believe is ideal, right? And so this mother now has tremendous influence over these young lives, and she's going to be a critical part and possibly the predominant part in the sense of immediate attention and immediate, the one who's closest to the action might be mom, right? And and that's okay depending on how dad wants to structure that. It says, but as for you, continue in what you have learned and firmly believe, knowing from whom you learned it. And where did Timothy learn that? That's Second Timothy 3:14, by the way. Well, we look at 2 Timothy 1:5 earlier in that same epistle. I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I'm sure dwells in you as well. Well, Timothy had a Gentile father, but he had faithful mother and grandmother, right? And this is where he learned the faith from, right? Obviously, Paul was teaching him, and he was discipling him, and Paul was his mentor, right? But he learned the faith initially from his mother and his grandmother, right? From Lois and Eunice. But at the same time, as Timothy became a man, right? It doesn't mean he can't ever talk to his mother about things of the faith or whatever, kind of fellowship with her in that way, but she's not his teacher. And she shouldn't have been since when he was becoming a young man, right? That would be, it could still be his dad, right? But he would now start to enter into these discussions with men in the church. And now, the pastor is possibly mentoring more, maybe one of the deacons of the church or some other man in the church that's a teacher. And he may have, more than one person mentoring him, and that's okay, right? But First Timothy 2:12 tells us that he does not permit a woman to teach, number one. So that's teaching doctrine. She's not to be the systematic or didactic teacher of doctrine or like theology proper, that kind of thing. Or she's not permitted to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she's to remain quiet. So nobody who is a man or who is like even at the cusp of manhood, right? So he's entering into it. He's now being looked at as a man, right? She's not to have an authoritative, assertive role and presence on him where she's telling him what to do and she's telling him what to believe and how to think anymore, right? She can still give him wisdom, right? He may go to her because he thinks she's wise, right? But ultimately, he is to learn too that he's to look to the men that God has put in that role in his life, right? And so then you look at seminaries, right? I think I should talk about this because number one, seminaries can be a huge problem. Men are not qualified to be elders because they go to seminary. And if you haven't gone to seminary, it doesn't disqualify a man whatsoever from being an elder, right? That's not scriptural. He does have to be competent to teach, but you don't need seminary for that at all. In fact, some men that I've seen be far more faithful to the text and far more effective as elders and teachers and disciple makers of young men have been more or less self-taught, right? Or they've only been taught by men in their local sphere of influence, and they haven't gone outside of the community or whatever to some seminary. Some of the biggest problems happen from there because they're men that get hired straight out of a seminary that churches may not even know. They haven't been able to evaluate him. They don't fully know his doctrine. They don't know his character, which is huge, right? And they just haven't seen him operate, and they take him out of this place, and they don't know what his orthopraxy is, what his habits are, that he's going to, how he's going to implement his doctrine and put it to practice within the church. So it's not just what he believes, but how he believes it's to be implemented. And the way you know that is by seeing how he operates in life, right? So it's a character thing, but it's also an orthopraxy thing. So that can be an issue, right? But one of the bigger issues that you have is any of these seminaries that have women teachers, right? You shouldn't have a woman teacher. There should be no women teaching, really, even at a high school level, or possibly parts of like junior high, depending on what age you consider that to be. But definitely never, ever, ever at a collegiate level, right? And that's not to say that, you might not have a woman that has a great deal of expertise in a specific subject, but she shouldn't have an authoritative role over any student that's a male ever, right? And anything that's directed at career or vocation or building a business, and anything that's like seminary specifically for pastor, which is a calling and a vocation, right? It's a ministry inside the church that correlates to an office of the church. And there's not one moment, because the seminaries to teach men to be pastors, right? Ultimately. And so, what business does someone who is expressly scripturally forbidden from being a pastor have in teaching someone to be a pastor and how that happens, what to do and all that? They can't, right? And there's going to be errors, and usually they're going to be subtle errors, at least in the upfront. Downstream, you can get into some massive ones and even apostasy, but the initial errors that happen up front are going to be smaller and they're not going to be as noticeable, but they have huge impact and ripple effects. And so they just don't have any business being any part of that. And so there's a lot of seminaries that are disqualified immediately because of that. If there's a woman teacher there, she shouldn't be teaching in a seminary, right? In fact, seminaries shouldn't even have female students, right? Bible colleges, sure, right, but not towards the end of vocation, but to equip mothers to be better able to, homeschool their children and helpers to their husbands and whatever they're putting the work of their hands to, right? And in that regard, regular colleges should be geared in a way to be equipping young women to, be a helpmeet, right? To have that role. And so, um, do we want them to be educated? Yes. I've heard Doug Wilson joke about the whole, oh, some people think we want women only to be able to be educated just enough to read the instructions on the back of the biscuit box, right? And that's all like hee hee hee, ha ha ha, right? But that's ultimately a stupid comment, right? Obviously, some of the most well discipled, well educated women I've seen have been in the most patriarchal circles. So obviously, that's not the case. However, we keep our the nature of male and female and the corresponding roles and commandments there. We keep them very distinct, and we try to be very precise and strict with that for good reason, right? Because it's foundational, right? If you stray from that, you're straying from almost everything. So. To kind of wrap this up, yeah, homeschooling is the ideal. It's okay, and not only okay, but in some ways even completely necessary to have Christian private schools. Again, the ideal should be from the church. There definitely should be churches and other Christian families beyond the ones that have their schools there that are participating and voluntarily. Although I do think the church as a whole, as an institution, has a duty there. But when you look at the other families individually, I think it has to be, out of the desire of their heart. They have to be inspired to do it, and not coerced into it, right? However, that being said, it should not be, well, if you want your kids to have this education, then you'll figure it out, Dad. You'll pick up a fourth job or whatever it is, and we'll make you pay some exorbitant fees to go into this school, kind of thing, right? So then finally we get to back to government education, and the way that we understand that right now is completely incompatible with biblical precept, with the Christian faith. It is a sinful institution, right? Number one, because you can't set it up in such a way that feigns neutrality or that doesn't explicitly give allegiance to Christ and doesn't found all subjects on the knowledge of Christ, right? And therefore, what is taught should be in keeping consistent with His Word, right? So when you look at social studies, you're not going to look at, uh, you know, anything about, the sodomy pride movement, right? Unless it is to teach kids how it's been corrupting the culture and why it's wrong, right? And it's sinful and how to correct that and all of that. And even then, I wouldn't think that would be something that the kids should be educated on until they're older, right? Um, any education regarding sex would be that there is no sex that happens outside of the covenant of marriage between one man and one woman. That's covenant is to be for life. That marriage is not about your happiness and personal feelings of fulfillment, but it's out of duty, and it's to be a picture of the gospel between Christ and His church, right? You teach that sex is towards the end of procreation, that there would be you'd fill the earth and subdue it, you'd be fruitful and multiply, that God desires godly offspring, right? So this would be how you would frame the idea of sex completely, right? In your education, that there's because all forms of birth control are abortifacient in nature, that things like abortion and abortifacients, therefore birth control being against the telos of marriage, against the telos of sex, and it kills children, that these things are basically unthinkable. They're not an option. We don't teach about them. And if we do, it's when kids are older and we teach them all of the reasons why they're wrong and bad, right? All the negative effects that they've had. And so, that's pretty critical. That you, again, all the ethics, they have to have an ethical component to all of their teaching, and the ethics correspond directly and very strictly to the scripture, right? You teach them about property ethics by teaching them biblical ethics about how other people are supposed to have the enjoyment of the property that God has blessed them with, that they have come into ownership of, whether it be their money or their lawnmower or their house, right? And you teach about how things such as eminent domain is wicked, right? Or stealing is wicked, or being reckless with someone else's property and breaking it is wicked, especially if you don't replace it, right? So that these instincts in them to restore somebody who suffers loss is automatic, and they also don't have a desire to steal from them just because they have compassion on somebody else, but rather they would desire to give of what they have, right? Or they would try to find someone who has those kind of resources that will willingly do it. You have all kinds of violence and confusion in the schools, and all kinds of immorality that would have to be completely wiped out of there, right? They give wrong ethics towards both young men and young women. They teach them to be very self-focused, both of them. Young men aren't taught duty to God and to family, which should be very strongly ingrained in them, right? There should be a strong sense of that in a young man. And in young women, they don't teach them that gendered piety for them is to be a homemaker, to be a wife and a mother, and to seek to be involved in those things, especially the nurturing and nourishing and comforting of children and so forth. And so they shouldn't be looking to some kind of career, right? But their career would be learning competence in the things that helps them love their husband and children, and then also learning to be a helper specifically to their husband and the things that he is going to be putting his hands to work to, that whatever skills or gifts that she's been blessed with are going to help multiply his efforts, right? So that he would be successful in everything that he puts his hands to, right? And yes, it's because of his diligence and his labors and efforts and his skill and whatnot, but it's also because of his wife's skills and her gifts and her diligence and her commitment to helping him, right? Um, so yeah, you have this um, uh, conflict of loyalties. Are you to have a loyalty to the government and learn whatever the government wants you to, whatever indoctrination they want, and you're taught a system of ethics that's divorced from the scripture, but is tied to a pagan government, right? And if it's pluralistic, it's pagan, right? So all of these things are important. So you can't have school like that. You also can't have school that's effectively being run by the state or federal level, right? It has to be very, very, very local, right? We need to learn localism again. We need to learn to be, you can have partnerships with other communities, even throughout your state. You can kind of have a sharing of resources if you would negotiate that. And that's agreed upon, I would say, by each community that would be contributing, right? Or at least each county, right? But you can't have a curriculum that is imposed on a school, especially with all the values that are tied to it, right? All of the theology that ultimately ends up coming from it, flowing from it. You can't have that being dictated by the state, like the literal state, or like the state as in the federal government, right? It can't come from that far away. You have to have something that is applicable to your community, that reflects the values of the community, and especially of the parents, right? The parents are number one there in terms of their values, and then the church is right there with them, not in terms of authority over it, but also like basically right there. That you can't have a pagan education. It's unacceptable. You can't have the interests of unbelievers being put on the same level as or trumping the interests of God and of the family and the church, right? That God would be preeminent over all. So even he is above the interests of the individual parents, right? Where, while the father is to be the spiritual head and he could remove his children from that school, and he needs to always have the authority to do that, no matter what the setting, that ultimately, kids are going to get a Protestant Christian education, right? They're not going to get a Catholic one. They're not going to get a Muslim one. They're not going to get a Hindu one. They're not going to get a religiously pluralistic one. They're not going to get a statist one or a Buddhist one. They're going to get a Protestant Christian education. So I think that's it for this episode. But if you have any questions or any pushback, please put that in the comment section. Love to hear from you. And also, I'm going to try to get a link in the description for supporting this ministry. If you would pray for us, we'd love that. But also, if you would consider partnering with us, we would greatly appreciate that as well. Thank you so much, and God bless.